Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today and to start the broader conversation about where technology fits in a resilient, climate responsive food system that can ensure we have security of food for all peoples around the world. I belong to an institute in Saskatoon that's trying to use technology in various ways to do that. So I'll bring some of my work and the work of many of my colleagues around the world to give you a sense of what we know and what we don't know about how technology can support a climate resilient agri-food system. I'm going to talk about the topic in three ways. First, I want to talk about the challenges to agriculture and the food system. My slides keep returning to the starting point. Second, I want to then talk about agriculture as both part of the problem of the climate conversation and how it can be not just responding to that problem, but it can be part of the solution set. And then thirdly, I want to talk about the pathways for biotechnology and other technologies to actually improve the prospects for food in the 21st century. So let me start with the challenges to food itself. I mean, food security in many ways is both a very objective measure of people being able to eat enough to survive and thrive, but it's also very subjective in that it depends a lot on the mix of policies and structures. It's an enduring concern. It's, food in and of itself is probably the most basic need of humanity. It's a source of employment for about a third of the world's population. It still is the single largest industry. And malnutrition and famines impose massive economic costs when and where they happen. And they happen, hunger is not a developing world problem. It's in every country in the world. It just has different causes and different elements. Objectively, we've conquered that problem. We have enough food to feed everyone. But practically, we have major disconnects. About 11% of our population is now hungry, and it's projected that as population grows and as the climate considerations emerge, that we're going to need to increase volumes of production everywhere around the world to ensure that we can maintain adequate nutrition. Food security is very localized. As I said, it's everywhere, but sub-Saharan Africa is sort of the epicenter of the particular problem, and it's a growing problem there. Some other areas it's significant, but it's a declining problem. We solve the food insecurity in some ways by trade. We have countries around the world like mine, Canada, the United States, Australia, parts of Latin America, parts of Northern Europe, and Asia that are food exporting countries. They technically produce more food than they need, and they export it to countries that need it. The challenge we face is that today, without any further changes of environmental effects, many of us are under stress. You can see pretty much everything along the equator, above and below, up to about 30, 35 degrees north and south, has some risk attached to it. And some parts are significantly at risk: lack of water, lack of other supplies. And even areas that are major exporters like Canada, Argentina, Australia, Argentina, are not without some concerns and pressures. And the climate itself will exacerbate that. This data is a little bit old, but as you can see that there's a few places like Canada and like the area I live in that we think production may actually be may have higher yields than it does under current conditions with the environmental changes. But virtually nobody else has that benefit. So most of the places that are food exporters are going to be having their own challenges of sustaining production. And that puts pressures on the world trading system. Interestingly, some crops are more resilient than others. I come from a world of wheat. Wheat is actually doing pretty well under this scenario, partly because it's located in climatic areas where the seasons will be getting a bit longer, the moisture will be more, but in bigger blocks of time. But over time, it will reduce the risk of crop damage. But as you can see in corn and soy, the risk rises almost monotonically in all three categories, whether it's small and modest yield challenges, medium and large challenges. So that's critical for the global food system. Those are foundational blocks to our diet. And some regions are particularly at risk. Once again, sub-Saharan Africa. It's the only part of the world that, under the projections in this case, will not be able to have available in their local ecosystem enough nutrition to feed everyone. Everyone else will have enough, but there will be imbalances locally, regionally, and continentally. So that's the challenge we have. And agriculture, as I said, is part of this climate conversation. And part of it's a problem set. It's contributing to climate. It's being affected by changes in climate. But also, it may be part of the solution set. Agriculture currently represents somewhere between 15 and 25% of the national greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And the estimate is that approximately 18% of global emissions are coming from the agri-food sector itself. The emissions for agriculture have been pretty static for a while. They're not going up massively, but as a percentage of global emissions, they're coming down. They were up at 23, 24%. So they're down about 5%. Some of that's good practices that are evolving, and I'll talk a bit about some of those, but some of it's just that other sectors are emitting more and more as we exploit more of our carbon-based energy systems. Greenhouse gases have been particularly rising for animals production. It's not the focus of my discussion today, but it's inevitable when you talk about agriculture. We have to remember that animals are a critical part of the global food system, and they're producing approximately 2/3 of the emissions from the agri-food sector. So whatever happens in plants has to be replicated and managed within the animal system itself. GHG emissions are falling for plant production, and what's left, might be hard to see, but what's left, you can see the blocks of what's there, but the blue box in the middle is fertilizers. Then you can see rice cultivation, crop residues, burning savannas for new crop areas, and sort of drained organic soils are the contributing elements. So there are still some significant contributions that science has to look at to see how we can mitigate and moderate and perhaps change the trajectory of the industry. The developed world is increasing efficiency and in some cases is getting to the point where we want the whole industry to be, but the rest of the world has to catch up in some ways, and so part of that's a policy challenge. And everywhere around the world, partly because of Glasgow, the focus is on one particular aspect of agriculture right now, and that's the role of nitrogen in the production system. And that looks to be low-hanging fruit, but it's problematic because nitrogen is a core part of the production and the productivity of the system. There's differential progress. Regional emissions are rising and falling in different areas. In the developed world, which is the small circles at the bottom, you can see in North America, Europe, and the Oceania, Australia and New Zealand primarily, emissions are flat to slightly down on fairly significantly rising yields. So per unit of output, emissions are down, but in the aggregate, they're starting to drift down slowly. The challenge is that in most of the developing world, which is where the food needs are most intense, production is going up, but so are emissions. So they have not yet decoupled in terms of the production possibilities. So what can we do about that? One thing is we may not need much. At one level, we don't need a lot more technology to get to where we want to be. This is one example. We have corn. Corn has really advanced varieties and some native, right down to some traditional varieties. If you take the United States as sort of the cutting edge of where corn production is in terms of its productivity, which is the first line, then I won't focus on any of the countries, but you can see depending on the country, and some of them are quite significant producers, their yields are significantly less than the American yields. And so there's missed opportunities. Part of that's the technology isn't transferring into those areas, and when it is, sometimes the rest of the industrial system isn't supporting the productivity that's necessary. So there's a lot of potential with the existing technologies we have now. Now that's a single technology. When you put it all together, you can actually get into a win-win scenario. This is some work I did with some colleagues in Western Canada. We're a major producer of 3 dryland crops: wheat and durum wheat, canola, an oilseed, and lentils as a pulse. 20-some years ago, 1985, we had significant use of summer fallow. So fallowing the fields where we would leave the fields empty for a year in a rotation, usually 1 in 3. That Reducing that and changing the technology, so adding new seeds, new chemicals, new machinery, new agronomy, new data, and ultimately moving towards zero-till technology has allowed the industry to go from a major net contributor of greenhouse gas to the environment to an actual carbon sink in the last 7 or 8 years that we were able to estimate. And so that's with existing technology. All it is putting it together in ways that generates a win-win scenario. And the interesting thing is that nobody did that because of climate policy. They did because it was good economics and good agronomy. We were mining our soils, we stopped mining our soils. So at the beginning of that picture, back in 1985, 5% of our land was zero-till. Up to a third of the acreage was fallow in any one year. Now you would have a hard time finding a fallow field in my province, and 75% of it is zero-till, and everything else is pretty much conservation tillage of one sort or another. Now, it doesn't work perfectly everywhere. Our neighbors next door are wet. They can't use some of this technology, so they haven't had the gains in climate events. And this is before we've even talked about climate policy. This was just done because it was good agronomy. If and when we get our focus on good climate technologies, we should be able to do better than that. We should be able to reduce the nitrogen and other emissions from the industry as a whole. So let me move on from that's where we are. What we want is technology that will feed the world efficiently, effectively, and in a resilient way so that no matter what happens to the environment and the climate, we can respond in real time so we don't have these gaps in food availability and food use. The FAO has identified a whole long list of things that could and should be done to move us towards a more resilient and adapted industry, including seasonal change and sowing dates. We've seen that picture I showed you of the Saskatchewan results. We moved our most valuable crop from the end of the seeding period to the beginning of the seeding period because we no longer had to worry about weeds, because it was a Roundup Ready and Liberty linked technology that was in the crop. So we went from the hottest time of the year to the coolest time of the year, and the area production doubled and the volume tripled. So that was simply just realizing we could move the product from one part of the year to the other without any corresponding loss in productivity in the other crops that are part of the rotation. We need different varieties and different species. 20 years ago, we didn't have commercial pulses that were available for large-scale use in Western Canada. Now it's our second or third largest crop on an annual basis. So we built up varieties that worked in multiple areas. We have a large growing area. We need at least 8 differentiated varieties for every trait to be able to serve the area effectively and efficiently. In the past, we used to produce 1, and that limited the uptake and use of technologies. We need better water supply and irrigation systems. Now, in our case, we don't irrigate. We're a bit like South Africa. We have a bit of irrigation, but it's for green vegetables and things. We rely on 15 inches of rain a year. That's not very much, considering a third of it comes in the winter in the form of snow. And we had one of our worst years ever in terms of rainfall during season, and our productivity didn't drop a bit. And it's partly because the soil organic matter was so strong based on the changes in cropping patterns that even with such weak rainfall, we were able to sustain our productivity. Inputs, we need them all. Not just any one, we need to optimize, not maximize. We need to use them effectively, efficiently. And new crop varieties is the anchor to all of this. None of the story I tell you about Saskatchewan could have happened there without the efforts of multinational companies who worked on canola, without the efforts of public-private partnerships that worked on lentils, and without the role of the global wheat research system that has built a really resilient, modern wheat breeding program. And ultimately, fire risk management is part of this. Not a big deal in my part of the world. We don't get a lot of fire, but it is in many parts of the world. All of those need innovation. Not innovation in terms of technology, innovation in terms of ability to take up and use new ideas in ways that advances the productive capacity and the resilience of the industry. So it's not just about picking up a new seed or a new air seeder or a new machine. It's about putting it together in the context of the overall production system. So let me tell you the difficult story. The research system to get from a really good idea to something that people derive value from is brutal. It's absolutely brutal. This is some work done by my colleague Greg Graff at Colorado School of Mines. They did a study of 530 innovations that were disclosed in the public space. And you can see as the various steps it went through, by the time they were done, 2 of those, less than 0.4%, actually were sustained in the market. So it's a trivial number of great ideas that get there. Most of them, and it's not just that the regulators stop the world. Over 90% of them are culled by the inventors themselves. They look at it and say, yeah, I could do that. But does it really change the world? I mean, is it really adding much value? So there's a challenge here. It's a brutal system we're working at. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, because all those innovations I've talked about came through this system. So we don't need to make many tweaks to have a material gain in output. Imagine if you could just double or triple that 0.4 or 1% success rate. So how do we do that? Well, there's actually a corresponding pyramid of opportunity that goes along with that sieve. There's different ways we can do research. Increasingly, we're moving back to mission-led research. My research institute, the Global Institute for Food Security, is just that. They don't do one-off projects. They do large-scale projects with a mission attached to them. They want to transform some part of the breeding space. When it comes to all these gestational activities, figuring out whether these things can be adapted and adopted and used effectively in industries, before you get to the legal commercial aspects, that's where partnerships are involved. They're not just public-private. They're not just multinational companies getting together with governments. They involve producers. All of the success we've had in Western Canada had a producer component to it. Associations and checkoffs that maybe didn't put a lot of money in, but they put a lot of information in, and they became a credible voice for translating and transmitting this information as it was finally ready for the market. Regulatory harmonization innovation is part of it, and we're all part of that space. It doesn't move nearly fast enough. I was a trade policy negotiator once, and my minister used to say it's like watching paint dry as you go through watching a negotiation. But over time, the paint does dry, and we add new coats, and eventually we get something different. And ultimately, there's a potential here with some of the new technologies to narrow the break-even point for new technologies, and so that we'll end up with a higher success rate. Right now, we've constructed a system that's designed to deliver large-scale innovations, but a lot of the smaller stuff that could be really important for niche markets and for smaller markets just isn't getting through because the costs of the gestational process and the time is too high. So how do we get there? I'm going to talk about 4 different things. I think there's a little bit about the aspirational goals of the research space. There's definitely a role for more effort to make the regulatory system resilient. There's questions about how do we assist people to adapt and adopt technology. It's not as simple as the textbooks say or as the marketers tell you. And at the end of the day, there have to be winners. Somebody's got to win out of this, or it falls apart. And so I'll talk about each of those in a brief way. First thing is that this is a global industry. Last numbers I have show that about $70 billion, US dollars, were invested in research and development in the global agri-food space. About 65% public-private, 35%, it's 60-40 public-private. The public money is a bit upfront, basic research to farm level. The private money is differentially. It's up. Some of it's up there, but differentially, it's in the branded food space. It's trying to pull into the high-value, high-return parts of the industry. When I talk to those people, and when I talk to the scientists that I work with internationally, they are talking 20 years from now. So when they talk from 20 years from now and what they think is driving large-scale capital flows at the nation-state level and at in many of the multinationals, is that one way or another, they fall into or overlap some of these three visions. One vision is that we get a seed industry that is machine learning, advanced, data-driven, that all the things that we worry about in our personal life as we use our electronic devices, that we apply those in the most positive way for agriculture. And so we move away from the bespoke, small-scale breeding programs, but to large-scale mechanized programs that reduce the cost and increase the speed. And so it's a mix of genomics and phenotyping, automated phenotyping, visualizations, big data mining. At the end of the day, the idea is to drive down the cost of discovery. Right now, the cost of discovery is a bit below 10% of the total cost of a new technology in the genetically modified space coming into the market, and about 13% of the time. That's about half the total cost it used to be 12 years ago. So these technologies are already starting to bring down the overall cost of production of those. The second one is the one that the farmers are particularly interested in, and that is making it work for farmers. So you produce something that's cool and going to generate some value to somebody in the industrial space. How do you make it work for farmers? And there, people call it different things, but essentially precision farming, optimizing everything, yields and inputs. And that's not at the field level. It's at some people say at the meter by meter level. Practically, they're talking about the 10 meter by 10 meter space. And so everything is differentiated enough to ensure you get the highest yield with the lowest cost, and you can very easily add climatic elements into that variable so that you're minimizing the effects or optimizing the benefits of the production system. It's sensing, it's drones, it's scripting, it's the whole bit. And scripting, so far, at least in trial space, with no change in input costs, just better management of what you use, is demonstrated to produce approximately a 6% return on investment. That's about the whole value of GM technologies. That's about all it's added to our productivity in agriculture. So just realigning what we can do is equal to the science effort that the industrial space has already done. So it could be a lot bigger as we move along because many of them aren't as efficient as the sectors that they're looking at, the farms they've been testing this on. Third one I won't spend a lot of time on, but certainly in places like Europe, parts of Asia, lots of North America, there's a real desire by the downstream data managers to move into food. You go to Silicon Valley, you go to the big branded food companies, you go to the online companies like Amazon, they're all saying that's an industry that's ready for disruption. How do we get in there and disrupt it? And their idea is that you'll be able to, in a trivial way, your refrigerator will tell you when you need a new product to be distributed. But more importantly, it will actually deliver what you want, not just what was in the machine. So the idea is that you'll get that pull through. Demand will drive supply over time. Nobody's quite cracked that one, but that's certainly the world that many people think we're heading towards in the developed world. So let's talk about the rest of these things. Regulation is a reality. It's necessary, but most of the regulatory effort we make is not necessary. It's excessive. It's a thicket. It's not just one country. Doesn't matter who you are, if you bring a product to market, you almost always have to think globally. The challenge I face as a scholar and a former practitioner of trade policy is we had a good system. We spent 100 years, agriculture was at the vanguard of trying to build an international science-based trading system. Dairy. They wanted to drive out bad dairy products, infected food products, and create efficient and effective trade. So all of this trade regime that we built, the free trade agreements, the WTO, and all of our other systems, were built on the background that food needs to be safe and nutritious and reasonably priced and tradable. Now we've gone back. GMOs, for some reason, triggered a nationalization and a renationalization of a regulatory system. So everybody wants to have a say in it. The science is the same, but different governments will come to different judgments on what the science says and what risks it entails. And there's a problem with that. If we look at the GM crop space, we have two big problems. three big problems. I'll talk to two here and one to come. One is that we only approve selectively what we want. So a lot of the things that have come to market are only approved for production in a few countries. Many of us will allow it for consumption, but not for production. Secondly, they're not all approved at the same time. For most products, there's a 3 to 5 year lag between the first approval and enough approval that you can actually internationally trade that product. For one product we've tracked, it took 20 years between the lead and the lag approver. So you've got to differentiate in the market, and that creates a coexistence problem that we can talk about in questions and discussion later. So we can manage the risk, but we get higher costs and lower success. The two studies done by CropLife International, the Phillips McDougall, and now the Ag Bio Investor, both show it's expensive to get a product to market. Over $100 million. It's coming down, but it's coming down because the science is making it cheaper. The regulatory costs are going up. And what's more important for firms is the time to market is doubled. The time to regulatory approval is doubled. That time is money to those enterprises, more so than in the public sector. And it varies a bit. Maize is most challenged. Other crops are less so. Cost duration, it depends on the various countries. There are opportunities to narrow this gap. It's not an impossible thing, and most of these are underway. We have international harmonization and standardization going on at the OECD, the WTO, usually through trade disputes, unfortunately, at the International Plant Protection Convention and the Cartagena Protocol. Each of them has challenges, but each of them is building an evidentiary base that is supporting the science-driven parts of the system. Public-private partnerships are core. The CG centers with the various multinationals and the national regulators are transmitting a capacity to assess and regulate and approve these varieties in regions. We have national and regional agencies, sometimes through regional trade agreements, sometimes just through mutual recognition agreements. Canada and the United States are sharing dockets, so the companies don't have to produce the same docket twice to reduce the costs and overhead and burden of these things. Industry itself takes a key lead. I've got to know NAGA, the North American Grain Association, and they speak, I'm probably misspeaking, it was something like thousands of events of something found in the food chain that shouldn't be there, or somebody thought shouldn't be there. It need to be handled on an annual basis. And so they're very much part of managing this science-based system. Farm leadership's important, the commodity groups in particular. Our canola crew in Canada had a lot to do with sorting out a trade dispute with China a number of years ago. And academic leadership is sometimes valuable. The GM Coexistence Conference, which ran for a couple of decades in Europe and the United States, spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to manage and build across these solitudes of GM-free parts of the world. The good news of all this is that some of the technology may break down these barriers. The break-even size is falling for some innovations. Bullock produced a really interesting study a while back that said that with GM technology, the minimum break-even acreage over multiple years in any number of markets was about 60 million. That's a lot of seed sales. And usually it required in most markets multiple years or multiple markets to break even. And they calculated as long as the regulatory system is responsive, the gene-edited crops could break down the profit recovery period from 60 million acres to around 2 million acres. So all of a sudden, you've dropped 95% in terms of the break-even market size. When GM started, I used to talk to the multinational companies, and they told wonderful pie-in-the-sky stories. And I sort of characterized as 20-20-100. They thought they'd do 20 crops with 20 variety key traits in 100 countries around the world. They ended up, now, they're talking 5-5-1. 5 crops, 5 key traits, 1 country that matters. If they can't make money in the United States on that trait alone, they don't do it. They will sell to other markets, but that's the dividing line. By moving towards a lower break-even point, we've got great potential to move past that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's critical to remember that adoption is not just, I've got the best mousetrap, and everybody's going to beat away to my doorstep. It's not just about telling them, persuading them, having them make a decision, having them implement it, and they confirm it by consuming it, and then they come back and buy more. That's what the marketers tell you it's all about. The reality is there's an awful lot of debate about fitting technology in. That's that block one. It's got to be trialable. It's got to be accessible in ways that people can buy small amounts and make it work. Secondly, it's got to be tested socially, and we found in GMOs that social restraint is a problem. And at the end of the day, it has to make money for enough people that they'll stay attached. And one of the critical parts of that is being able to move the technology in a practical way between the labs and the farmer. And seeds are critical. And one of the concerns we have in the world is that there's not much of a commercial seed trade. In North America, about 90% of the stuff that's planted is store-bought. So every year you buy the latest technology. In Middle East and Africa and Asia, more than 60% is bin run. It's farmer-saved seed. So you're using last year's technology or last decade's technology, which is why in that corn picture there's so much of a gap between the leaders and the rest. And one of the critical things is the commodity groups. That second graph is Canada. We have a lot of bin run seed, especially in wheat. But notice canola, partly because of the science and the agronomy of canola. But the reason canola is so big and such a successful product is because we have an industry that got out there, the farmers got out there and sold it to themselves. And the adoption rates were very fast and significant. So I'm going to wrap up with the question of where do we, how do you keep this system operating? And how you keep it operating is people get something for their effort. This is one example. My friend and colleague Nick Kalasandonakis at Missouri and others, Julian Alston and others, did a major modeling exercise where they looked at the impact of the adoption of soybeans. You can see that anybody that adopted soybeans, producers got a share of it, so did the companies that produced the seeds. Anybody that didn't adopt it, the producers had more competition. They lost. The consumers all benefit because compared to otherwise, production was higher, prices were lower. Anything that's a competitor to soybeans, like canola, palm, and soy, the producers lost because they're competing against a more competitive crop. The consumers gained. Corn and wheat, the producers gained because wheat producers moved into soy. And so at the end of the day, the benefits transcend far more than the farmer who chooses to produce or not. They're spread worldwide to countries that aren't even part of the conversation. When you take this and add the other 5 or 6 major crops and all the different markets, there's a massive impact, only about half of it which stays in the food system itself. So the money is important, but there's more than money to these technologies. In many cases, they can be accessible to different kinds of producers. In the area of GM crops, a lot of farmers, over 90% of the farmers, were in resource-poor parts of the world. Farm incomes come up, and that allows the farmers to increase their nutrient intake and improve their household incomes. In countries such as South Africa, there's some evidence that the adoption of herbicide-tolerant crops and insect-resistant crops saved farm labor. And that farm labor came from the family, and the family could use that labor for other activities, either paid employment or education. And finally, there were environmental gains through better chemical use and lower tillage. So if I want to leave you with one message, agricultural production and food security is both challenged by and part of the solution set for climate change. Africa is ground zero for that challenge. It has the most at risk, but also potentially some of the greatest opportunities because it's lagging some of the technology that already exists now. Agriculture can be a critical part of managing our greenhouse gas as well as responding to the risks that are related to that. And technology is going to be a core part of that. We do have pathways to impact, but for every pathway, there's a hurdle. It's not a barrier. There's just something we have to figure out how to launch over. Some of the hurdles we can lower, some of them we might be able to remove, but there always are going to be hurdles, irrespective of regulatory regimes and others. And at the end of the day, there are vital and valuable opportunities here for all actors in the global agri-food system to do well for themselves by doing good, by actually making technologies that are available and useful for farmers and farm families and the food systems around the world. Thank you.